Level 1, Limbo. The first level isn't really considerable hell. It's basically Earth, but you can't die. Level 2, Lust. This is where people who've committed sexual sins go, and it's the most used temptation by the devils to bring people into hell. Level 3, Gluttony. In Level 3, there is a constant pouring of a mixture of rain, sleet, snow, and hail, with people constantly being pelted with ice. Level 4, Greed. When they first enter Level 4, they see a sea of people constantly running into each other like waves and beating each other with big money bags. Level 5, Wrath. There is a sea of mud with people constantly trying to push each other down to come out on top, and there are bubbles coming up from the mud, which are actually coming from people underneath screaming and crying. Level 6, Heresy. This is the first layer where people are actively sinning against someone else, so from here on, they get active torture and suffering instead of just misery. Level 7, Violence. The 7th level is divided into 3 parts: the outer ring for violence against others, the middle ring for violence against themselves, and the inner ring for violence against God. Level 8, Fraud. Level 8 is for the deceptive speakers, those who lied to get what they wanted, and it consists of a giant pitfall of poop. The idea is that those who behest now are full of BS, always fighting and trying to push each other down. Level 9.
CEDH.
The 9th level, the deepest one,
is an 11-hour game of CEDH in the finals of the SLC 10K, where one player stalls for 5 hours just to force a draw. And I'm here to tell you, hell is real. In that case, let's welcome everybody into a brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony, a man with at least 2 modes, watching birds and wrangling nerds, Maddox.
And on my back face, I can grow molds and make pickles.
Has to rhyme. Growing molds and rolling folds in noodles.
Perfect. No notes.
Wait, let's just go to Rhyme Zone real quick. Hold on. I gotta set me something better than growing molds and having colds. Growing molds and being a scold. Growing molds and...
You know what? I'll just stick with the first 2 molds. two modes is enough. We don't need a mold.
Growing mold and being a kobold.
Sure. The creature type I'm famously very, very obsessed with.
We're talking about modal spells on this episode, Anthony. It's been a little while since we did just a clean old bread and butter technical episode of the podcast where we talk about game design, mechanics, how cards function, how they affect gameplay, how they affect cubes they're included in. I think it's time we went back to our roots.
I agree. I mean, I enjoy our more meandering episodes about philosophy and aesthetics, and maybe we'll just end up back there anyway, but I think at least we can try to be a little bit more game designy, a little more techie here.
I was telling my friend about some of the feedback on the most recent episode of the podcast because they were asking me how I was, and I was like, well, I'm dealing with all this right now. And they were like, they were like,
that doesn't sound great if that's your attitude coming into your hobby.
Well, I mean,
I'm dealing with all this right now.
That's a bit of an exaggeration, but I was like, yeah, it's early in the week, so it's the couple days where I get a bunch of feedback from all edges of the globe from a bunch of people that listen to the podcast and have thoughts about it.
What was the feedback like? Maybe we should have this conversation. I could not keep track of the Discord this week, I'll be honest.
I barely kept track. I thought the Discord conversation was really interesting. And look, part of the thing is I sent a bunch of screenshots to my friend, to be clear, and she was like, how do you live?
You're sending screenshots of people's private messages?
It's not private. The Discord is public.
Okay, you're right.
And also, I said screenshots of the Discord. I said screenshots of the Reddit. I said screenshots from YouTube, from Spotify. We get comments in a lot of places. And she was like, just couldn't understand how my life was like being barraged with feedback from all different corners. And she was like, nobody in these, like, everybody's making so many assumptions in these comments. I'm like, yeah, they listened to an hour of us talking, and so they assume they have the entire picture, and then they heard our side of the conversation. Now they want to give their own side of the conversation, right? Anyway, I forget where I was going with this, but yeah, I'll be excited to do an episode where the feedback will be like, actually, kicker is better than cycling, instead of, did you ever consider that your suggestion that you can have taste in Cube is toxic, elitist, gatekeeping, othering, judgmental, and an attempt to rationalize your own prejudice? Certainly not just an opinion I disagree with. Definitely all that stuff.
Yeah, now there's something I have a lot to say about. What if we just get really deep into that?
We'll save that for a bonus feed episode in the
Okay,
future.
sure.
That's not for the main feed. But
yeah, definitely be sure to write in on why you think that our evaluations of different modal effects is wrong, because that's engagement.
That's for sure engagement. Yeah, we'll definitely have an episode of the bonus feed someday. That's why I'm a Cheesecake Factory boy.
A bonus feed, you say?
Used to be a Cheesecake Factory boy back in the day. You have a phone charger with you?
Yeah, I just noticed my phone was like totally
You
dead
just
as
sit
I was walking.
You sit at your desk all day. You just didn't have your phone plugged in?
I didn't look at it.
Yeah, well, what are you going to do?
Look, I didn't look at my phone. I didn't look at the YouTube comments.
It's good. It's better not to do those things. Anyway, we're going to have a nice, clean, mechanical episode where all disagreements will be not about broad worldviews and perspectives, but simply about a children's card game. What's a modal card, Anthony?
Hey, well, I think I would describe it as a card that has multiple different modes that you can choose from. So it is, obviously, we're going to get into lots of different gray areas here.
One of the questions that my friend asked is, how does Anthony deal with all this feedback? And I was like, well, Anthony is very careful not to make any strong statements on the show. And in fact,
I'm not even going to make a strong statement about what a modal card
was, and you think, well, to me, it's this. Leaving room for people to completely disagree with you about what a modal card is.
Yeah. I think I like to just go with the sort of tentpole definitions. The most extreme examples of the modal cards are the ones that literally just have bullet points and say, choose one of these three options, and that's your modal spell. But there's lots of gray area and things that you could kind of like just word the card differently so it read like that, but maybe for one or many reasons it doesn't. So that's a modal spell.
Yeah, a spell that does not have a discrete outcome, but multiple discrete.
See, now we're getting a little bit tricky, though, because, like, is a lightning bolt a modal spell because it can deal damage to a player or a planeswalker?
That is
or
in the
creature?
grayest of gray area. I do not think we should count lightning bolt as a modal spell for the purposes of this discussion.
Okay,
I think we should talk about spells that have explicit
disenchant.
Modes. No.
Okay, what about the
just because it
disenchant?
has the word or in it?
Exactly.
You did a Scryfall search for or and was like, yes, all of the modal spells.
Well, what about the one that either destroys artifact, enchantment, or exiles a thing from a graveyard?
Yeah, I think that's modal.
That one's modal, okay.
Yeah.
But not lightning.
Those are two different
bolt.
things. Wow, I can't believe we got here already. This is insufferable. What a show. What a podcast we have. I think it's useful to define them for the purposes of this conversation as cards that have explicit modes where the modes are sufficiently distinct enough that the card can serve very different roles. Is disenchant modal because it can destroy an artifact or an enchantment? Kind of, but you're putting it in your deck for the one role of removing a thing from your opponent's battlefield.
Or removing a different kind of thing from your opponent's battlefield.
No. Is lightning bolt modal in the sense that it can be targeting multiple different things? Kind of, but I think for the purposes of this conversation and how modal cards affect cube design, draft decisions, gameplay decisions, deck building decisions, I think we should focus on cards that have explicit, separate modes.
Okay, what if it said destroy target artifact, enchantment, or creature?
That's basically destroy target non-land permanent, except not a planeswalker.
Yeah, I'm trying to work my way up. I'm trying to work my way up to Vindicate
I'm
here.
going with no. That is not modal because it's on its way to Vindicate.
Okay. The modal cards actually go back way further and in a lot more volume than I expected. Even in Alpha, they're just a bunch of cards that they don't necessarily look formatted in the cleanest way, but it's just like this card just says do this thing or do this other thing. And some of them are kind of similar, like counter a red spell or destroy a red permanent. But, I mean, would you agree that those feel like very different modes?
That is much closer to modal, yeah, I think so.
Or like gain life versus prevent damage, having both those options on one card. And the charms happened also really, really early in Magic. So a couple of those cards that just give you multiple options or even all the way back in Alpha, and then in Mirage and some of those other certainly sets, the named charms that just say choose one, and they're very distinct modes, like, you know, gain a life or shrink a creature or exile a thing from a graveyard. And a lot of those early cards are just like lots of little trinket options, but those are very distinctly modal cards in the sense that you're describing.
Yeah, this is good. I want to go on kind of a like walk through history of modal cards and modal mechanics and kind of talk about what we think about each of them. And then I think at the end, and you can check the timestamps if you want to jump around, I do want to talk about how this impacts cube design specifically, like how many modal cards ought you include, what are the impacts of including lots of modal cards versus very few modal cards, etc. And yeah, they go all the way back to the origins of Magic. Like the very first set had cards that were modal, and then we started to get much more explicitly modal cards very shortly after. What do you think about the cards like the charms, where it's just kind of like, here are 2 or 3 completely unconnected effects that are under the same spell that you can choose between?
There's a couple different factors here, and I think that looking back at some of these early charms, I kind of find them appealing. Maybe it's partly just because I'm sort of used to them, or, nostalgia's not the right word, but they seem like very fundamentally part of Magic's history. In general, though, the ones that have totally disconnected options, I find much less appealing. They have, like, a lot of gameplay ramifications, and so there's a lot of reasons you might want to put into a cube, but the aesthetics of it are just kind of, like, not that interesting to me. It's like, okay, well, here's the charm that either exiles a thing from a graveyard, or gains me 1 life, or does some other totally separate trinket thing. It just reads kind of like a menu than a magical spell that I, a wizard, am trying to cast, and, has a really important, distinct role in the deck that I'm crafting it with.
Do you think the gold charms have an aesthetic in that they oftentimes, I feel like the modes are reflective of the colors that compose the charm? Is that enough of an aesthetic sort of story for you to like get interested in it? I'm thinking of like Esper Charm, which pretty clearly has like a black mode, a white mode, and a blue mode.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that even if it isn't aesthetic in a sense of like, oh, well, here clearly is my dragon that's doing the dragon thing, it's still an aesthetic in terms of the game's mechanics.
It's like a meta aesthetic. It's not telling a story in the fiction of the game, but there is a sort of resonance to the entire design.
Yeah, or some of the other ones are even just like, oh yeah, Seedling Charm. This does the green things, so it's still reinforcing the color pie and playing a role in the game in that way, not just like feeling like it's patching holes on, an uneven brick wall.
I feel like you were the first person I heard describe not liking just kind of a menu of disconnected options on a card. And it made me reflect on my own card choices because I historically have just really enjoyed modal cards. I think they meet a lot of the goals I have for my gameplay in a lot of the cubes I design, which is giving players outs in lots of situations. The more effects you can have in your deck, the more outs you're going to have. Giving players more decisions to make because, again, the more modes you have, the more decisions you have to make. And also, I think that a lot of modal cards tend to be... I mean, this is not universally true, but there tends to be a lot of interaction in modal cards. Like, if there's multiple modes, there's only so many modes that just help you. It's like, make a creature. It's kind of the one mode that just builds up your board, or go get a land out of your deck, builds up your board. But once you get into multiple modes, a lot of them end up dealing with something having to do with your opponent, and I really like interactive Magic. And so, for those reasons, I've historically, going back to the earliest days of my investment in the game, really liked modal cards. And then you were the first person, I think it was honestly during spoiler season for Eldraine, and we were looking at Charming Prince, and you were like, this is just a dumb menu of disconnected effects. I am not interested in a card that, like, why are any of these things charming or princely, or how are they related to each other? And I was like,
I stand by that.
I was like, yeah, you're totally right. And that perspective has definitely made me think a lot about the modal cards I include in my own cube now. When there's this menu of options in the charm style, or we'll get to talking about things like the commands and confluences, which are kind of riffs on this idea, I look for ones that are resonant in their overall design for some reason, and I try to avoid the ones that are just like a mishmash of things.
Right. I think it's also difficult to talk about this idea sort of divorced from the idea of rate, but that's something that I think makes me a little bit more interested in some of the earlier modal cards, because the effects are sort of both underpowered individually, like you're getting worse effects for the amount of mana you're spending on the bonus of flexibility. And I think that you're right, that there's just like a bunch of effects that they will put on these charms, especially the early ones, that you otherwise just wouldn't have access to in your deck. Like, nobody's going to put a card in their deck that just does that one random little trinket thing. But then the fact that that mode occasionally comes up just gives you more diverse gameplay. A lot of the more modern ones, it's like, well, this card is just always above rate. It's always good for me. It doesn't seem like it's adding that interesting nuance because, yeah, Charming Prince is like, I'm just going to do the one mode that's best for me all the time.
Yeah, thinking to the, like, cycles, the charms almost always come in cycles, and I think the example of Esper Charm is one that is very resonant to me, where some of the other, like, Jund Charm doesn't work as well because they clearly have a template they're trying to fill, and sometimes there aren't obvious modes that fill that template, and you can tell that it's kind of forced. I also think back to the original... What is the cycle of dragons from Planeshift, like Rith and Dromar the Banisher? Like, we're not dragon legends, but... Well, they are legendary cool dragons, but I'm sure they have some name in the lore that everyone's commenting right now. That cycle of dragons also had corresponding charms, and I remember some of those being great, and some of them being just like, all right, this is a really clunky sort of implementation of this effect, because when they have a template where it's like, we're going to have 3 modes and 3 colors, sometimes it works, sometimes they're clearly trying to like work backwards from the structure, and the actual, mechanics they choose don't really sing.
Yeah, that's a really good point about sort of the challenge of cycles in general, and maybe that's another topic we could dig into on a future episode.
I have one last question about the charm sort of modal cards. What do you think about the fact that very often the modes are wildly different power levels or likely to come up a wildly different amount of the time. The most obvious example I can think of here is that some old school cubes include Vision Charm, and they mostly include Vision Charm because it's a combo with Phyrexian Dreadnought. And in that situation, it's like you're looking at a card that has really dinky, trinkety effects, and you're like, why would I ever want to play this card? And the answer is, well, you play it because this one mode actually matters a lot.
Yeah.
Or like just knowing what like the best modes are on a modal spell. How do you view that in terms of net cost or benefit to a cube environment?
I think there's kind of sort of sweet spots along that spectrum of how often do all the different modes come up, where if 100% of the time you're doing the same thing with it, which in that specific example I think is going to be the case, like the other modes in a very high-powered cube are just not going to come up, then it's just like, well, this card has extra text that's going to be, you know, taxing people trying to understand it, going to be more confusing if your opponent's casting it. So I don't love that spot. It's also maybe honestly not as interesting if you're casting all of the modes equally, like it's 2 modes and you're casting each 50% of the time, then it's just you're fully having to evaluate the card all the time. It's kind of nice when it's somewhere in between where it's like, yeah, I have a good hook in understanding what this card is about because it's mostly for A, but 5 to 25% of the time it's going to do something unexpected. That's kind of, I think, the most interesting space for me.
I honestly think the card I can think of with the perfect spread of frequency with which the modes come up is Cryptic Command. It's like every mode is...
Oh my god, I tried to understand Cryptic Command this week.
It sounds like you were trying to understand Thopter Sword combo more than Cryptic Command?
Thopter Sword combo, but when can I cast Cryptic Command? Like, how do the priority shifts
cast it whenever you get priority.
Right. So that's what I was trying to understand, is the combat steps. When do I get priority such that can I make sure my opponent does not have any Thopters? The answer is no.
Anyway, I think Cryptic Command is the perfect example for me because, to me, the sort of like baseline mode, the most common use case of Cryptic Command, in my mind at least, and people may honestly disagree with this, is counterspell draw card. And the other modes do come up pretty often. Being able to bounce a thing and tap down all your opponent's creatures, like it's not like they're 5 or 10% of the time. Like if it's, you know, if counterspell or draw a card is included in 40% of the castings of it, I feel like it's like not a huge delta between that and the other modes. But you're right, it's nice that like when I think about it in my deck, I think about it as like, here's a counterspell I have. It's a counterspell with other things it can do, but I don't think of it as a bounce spell or a weird tap effect because those aren't as much like categories of cards I'm trying to think about in the sort of curve of my deck. But I definitely think about it as a counterspell. And then those other modes are, I think, very relevant and come up quite a bit.
Yeah, they definitely come up. I think something else that's cool about, so we're talking about modal spells that often have very discrete sort of non-overlapping options. There are other kinds of modal spells where the modes do kind of relate to each other. And honestly, I think something like Cryptic Command or other cards that are either counter a spell or draw a card, that's maybe very different effects, but they are both effects you want in the same deck, and it like appeals to a cohesive strategy. And the fact that you have this mode Cryptic Command to tap down your creatures, that's like a perfect safety valve on a control deck, or maybe a spells deck that's trying to have one big turn where you need to tap down all your opponent's blockers. So
it's also 3 modes that you very often want at instant, like they're instant speed effects,
right?
Only, or you know, way better at instant speed, plus the draw a card mode kind of stapled on for blue mage value.
And I think in the most extreme cases, you know, the order of the modes can matter. You choose whichever ones you want on most modal spells, but then they resolve in the order they're written on the card.
Printed order, yeah.
And I think it's really cool when that matters, and there's like something like, oh, first you make a token, and then you put some counters on it, and then have it fight something. It's like, there are certain modal designs where the modes interact with each other, and I think those are really fun. I think a bunch of the spree cards that we'll talk about in a bit, I think, follow that pattern. It was sort of deliberate that the modes did something with each other.
I can already tell we're not going to get through all these mechanics now. Maybe this will be a multi-series episode.
A lot of these are pretty simple, or
I mean, I would have thought the charms was like one of the simplest ones, and yet we talked about it for like 12 to 15 minutes.
All right,
so
the commands.
Do you want to go commands next, or do you want to keep going chronologically?
Yeah, I mean, I think that
I think putting the commands and confluences in here are kind of like just riffs on the charms.
Let's just throw that in here. As a lot of these mechanics are just riffs off of each other. So once we have the basic, choose one of these 3. The commands are a cycle of cards that isn't a named mechanic, but they've all been named command in order to make it clear that they all sort of function the same way. And they all have 4 different modes and let you choose 2 of them. So, I mean, we're just talking about Cryptic Command.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of these, you know, Krenko's Command, choose 2, make a goblin, make a goblin, make a goblin, make a goblin is my favorite one. But there are a bunch that Yeah, I don't think they're functionally that different. It's just they do a nice little thing in terms of making the cards easier to parse by naming them consistently.
Doesn't Krenko's command just make 2 goblins?
Yes, that's my very good joke.
How's it a joke? You chose the one card that has command in the name that does not match this pattern.
I know. That was the joke.
How is it a joke? Explain the joke to me.
The way the card should be written is choose 2, and it should have 4 options that are all make a goblin.
Okay, so that wasn't clear. I thought you were saying your favorite mode of Krenko's command was to make one goblin 4 times, and I'm like, I don't get it. Okay, I get it now. Maybe other people got it, and they'll have already laughed and been like, Andy's a dumb, which is fine. Yeah, and I think that's some of the, honestly, like some of the coolest, lore is not the right word, some of the coolest like meta stuff they do in Magic is when they develop additional meaning for this language. Like the fact that a command is something in Magic that is not an explicit mechanic. It's not like written down somewhere in like, a lore book. It's just that you come to know while looking at a lot of cards that commands follow this structure. 4 options, you choose 2. And charms, very often 3 options, you choose 1. I think almost every instance of charms is 3 options, you choose 1. Confluences, which are 3 options, you choose 3, but you can choose the same mode more than once, which is also a really cool sort of riff on this. I think it's so cool that these words end up getting this additional meaning that you can then learn and incorporate into your understanding of the game.
Yeah, I think that when it works really well. Sometimes I kind of don't love the neologisms, especially if they're kind of using words in not necessarily the most meaningful way, but like, yeah, charm feels very flavorful. It's like, here's my little spell, and it doesn't do anything big and crazy. It's just going to help me out in my wizard journey. And commands are having multiple options because it's the directive from the big legendary dragon or whatever. Like, I think that all feels pretty cohesive to me.
What's your least favorite neologism in Magic?
Probably edict. I mean, it's not necessarily maybe neologism in the most strict sense, but I mean, there's a lot. Mark Rosewater loves to make neologisms.
Do you have any specific thoughts about the commands or the confluences that are unique to those rather than just the sort of big encapsulation of all of these sort of charm-esque mechanics?
I don't think so. I mean, obviously, we could also sort of extend that from just a lot of those that we're talking about are instant sorceries. There are plenty of creatures that have on ETB cast a charm, basically, like we're talking about Charming Prince. So it does kind of
I literally didn't get that till right now. Oh my god! And I even said earlier, what's charming about any of this?
You sure did.
Oh my god! Wow, I never got that.
There are also some enchantments that trigger, like, at the beginning of your combat step, do one of these 3 and things like that. So there are plenty of other instances outside of just instants or sorceries where the same kind of mechanical structure comes up in the game.
Do you count the Pawprint mechanic as this same category of mechanic? I think it basically is.
It basically is. It's kind of like the Confluences, but with this weighting where you can choose the same more than once, but they have different sort of weights.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also just a weird mechanic. I think it's cool. I don't hate it.
I think it's cool too. It's just, I can't believe that there wasn't a more elegant way.
Interesting. I was going to say the opposite, where I'm like, this is kind of weird and doesn't look like what I'm expected to be when I start reading the card, but I think it is kind of a neat way to communicate what could be kind of an abstract idea to people, that like, you can do some of these, but in only certain combinations.
Yeah, I feel like
could I do better?
Implies you could somehow like make paw prints with other cards.
A lot of people were like, "Oh, this is like energy," and it's like, no, it's not. It's
not.
It's just for the.
It is
the
entirely
duration of the
self-contained on
spell.
the card. It's just trying to help you sort of understand the weight of these different modes.
Honestly, I think if they had printed those before printing energy or poison or anything else, it would be like, wow, this is perfect. And it's only because we have this extra part of our lexicon to deal with that it makes it more complex.
Anyway, I wonder if there's a way they could have done that more elegantly. I think that has a lot of additional baggage and complexity that has me shying away from it in my own cubes, but it definitely fits in this category of just, here's a menu of options, choose some of them, but rather than choose any 1 or choose any 2 or choose any 3 and you can choose options more than once, it's this more complicated, choose up to 6 paw prints worth of effect or whatever.
The paw prints is the weirdest part of it, because like, I think it was only a cycle of 5 cards, right, in Bloomburrow, and if
not many.
If they bring that back, are they going to... I mean, again, like you're saying, it's totally self-contained. They could just say, in this set, it's race car tires or whatever silly thing they're doing these days. You get 6 Funko Pops to choose from.
Yeah, I think...
I was going to say the day that they print a Funko Pop in Magic is the day that... But they already did.
What's next in the history of modal mechanics then, Anthony?
I think the next thing that I found that I would consider a modal mechanic is cycling, which is kind of a thing we see all the time and maybe don't think of it in that same category, but you could just imagine it as a modal card where one of the modes is discard and draw a new card.
Not to mention the fact that there are so many cards that say when you cycle this, do a thing, which is making it much more explicitly modal.
That's a great point, yeah.
There's a lot of those these days.
Crows and Tuskers, either a big creature or get a land and draw a card.
And this was in Urza's Saga in 1998, the first time we got a cycling card. Parker, notoriously somewhat anti-cycling. What is your take on cycling from a game design perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point to bring up, that on one hand, I love cycling. It's like, well, who wouldn't want the option to be able to get rid of the cards that are irrelevant?
Well, but we talk all the time about how players want lots of things that we shouldn't give them as cube designers.
Exactly. So it's like, it maybe solves an acute problem to give lots of card cycling so I can get rid of my situational cards, or if I get mana flooded or mana screwed. On the other hand, I think I first heard this from, it might have even been Ben Stark, but somebody on Limited Resources was talking about how they didn't love one of the sets. No, it couldn't have been Ben Stark. He loves cycling.
Surely whoever was talking about Ikoria, where the cycling one came
No,
around.
I think it was in Kaladesh or something later
no cycling
than
in Kaladesh.
Doesn't matter. Their point that I thought was really interesting was
cycling, which is right after Kaladesh.
There we go. That was the one. Their point was they didn't love it, that it was too easy to just free roll and include a lot of really narrow cards in your deck, and like normally there's a certain expectation that the Broken Wings type effect that's going to destroy a flying creature is not something people are main decking, so you can be fairly confident in what your opponent's doing when you play your flying creature. And it was just so easy to play those situational cards because they had cycling, so it ended up removing some of the sort of dynamic and diverse range of games that you would have, because everybody would just always include all the cycling cards. So it is funny how, even though like solving that acute problem might seem like a good thing, too much of it can kind of end up creating more of a mushy gameplay experience.
How much do you think that effect is related to rate? Like, that makes sense to me a lot in Retail Limited, where it's like, now I get to include all these cards with cycling, and I have all these options, and worst case scenario, I just cycle them and, keep drawing through my deck. And in the case of Ikoria, so many things have cycling 1 that they're actually actively good because I have all these cycling payoffs, so...
Yeah, okay, you're right that Ikoria is the much more extreme example of this.
But that to me makes a lot of sense in Limited. I very rarely feel that way in Cube. Like, the cycling spells are just kind of like free includes, mostly because, pound for pound, most cubes play more efficiently, more powerfully than the average Retail Limited set, and the power level band tends to be narrower, and so if I'm paying an extra mana, half a mana, for the utility being able to cycle something, I more often feel like that matters a lot in a cube deck, where it felt like in Limited, it's like I'm going to play a bunch of Ds anyway, or Cs anyway. That's what Retail Limited's all about. You're going to be playing a bunch of filler plus a couple bombs. Do you feel like that actually comes up in Cube, where like it's kind of mushy and everybody's just can do everything they want all the time because they have cycling cards?
I think you're right that it has so much to do with rate, and rate only makes sense in a specific context.
Yeah, it's all relative.
So, yeah, it's all relative. It's all difficult to speak about abstractly, but in my experience, generally not. And I think you're right. It's that the cubes that we're often playing, decks are very synergistic. They're much quicker. You can't necessarily afford to just spend 4 or 5 mana just cycling some random cards, so you can't necessarily do that. But I do think that, I think there are bigger ways that a lot of modal cards impacts my gameplay experience, and the biggest one is just like amount of text to parse and read. And I feel very much these days like if I see a bunch of modal cards that I'm unfamiliar with in a cube, it's just going to be a lot of extra friction just for me to read and parse those cards, and figure out what are the modes that matter to me, what are the modes that might be relevant to my deck, and know how to evaluate those modes on their rate.
But that's one of the benefits of cycling. One of the modes is like, by almost every Magic player, completely
True.
internalized. Like, there's no thinking about it. It's like, oh, it's got cycling. You immediately understand the sort of texture that adds to your deck and the value that might provide.
Yeah, and cycling has this extra layer to it, which is that there are enough cards with cycling and enough things that interact with it, either interacting directly with whenever you cycle, or interact with caring about having stuff in your graveyard, or caring about whenever you draw a card, or caring about when you discard, that it's easy for a lot of cubes to then add this second layer of, oh, you have enough cards that care about cycling, maybe you're actually the cycling deck and you're trying to mechanically do something else with this. And then I think that also sort of affects the meta, and maybe like if there is somebody that is soaking up all the cycling cards for their cycling deck, you're not necessarily going to see a lot of these like weird fringe effects coming out of a deck unexpectedly.
Which I want to make sure I don't misrepresent Parker's position. Parker's position is that Parker really likes cycling cards when they are on situational cards or, your...
Oh yeah, I forgot that conversation got weird.
It was very weird. He likes all the cycling cards
except for all the cases that it is.
Well, he does. What he doesn't like is the cycling deck specifically. I think he really likes the mechanic. He does not like when you turn your deck into a situation where every card is just fungible because you're just always going to cycle everything all the time, which... You can go back and listen to our discussion about that if you want to hear it in more detail, but I maintain that I think that is overstated, that happens very rarely, and you are still going to care about the other modes of the other cards. Your cycling deck is very rarely literally just going to cycle everything the way that it did in Ikoria Limited, which was the most toxic cycling deck I think we've seen in any limited format. Anyway, that is Parker's position, is that deck is boring and not conducive to the kind of gameplay he likes.
Cycling also is doing something very different from the explicit modal cards as well, in that it has different costs associated with the cycling and the cost of the spell. So
yes.
The modal menu style cards are just, here's the cost, pick any number of these effects or a certain number of these effects, whereas cycling has a separate cost. So mechanically, a lot of these things that I think we're looking at could kind of just be, rewritten into the different mechanics. These two could not easily.
What do you think of the fact that cycling is uncounterable? It's an ability rather than actually casting a spell.
That's a great question. I think that it's kind of cool that you have this sort of sideways way to dodge counter spells when you have a separate effect that's stapled to cycling. I think that's something that's just going to really come up to people having the right expectations, because that can also be really frustrating if you don't understand that nuance. But for the most part, the fact that drawing a card, if there's no extra abilities associated with the cycling effect, that's not something you're generally going to be wanting to counter anyway, so I don't have strong feelings about it.
Yeah, it's funny. I agree that if it's just plain cycling, you are very rarely going to counter that no matter what. And there it's actually, I think, more of a downside that it doesn't trigger your spellcast stuff, right? I was very excited about Hieroglyphic Illumination in the Bud Magic Cube for a long time, and eventually I cut it because I was like, I'm cycling this, I don't know, call it 65% of the time, and when I do, I'm not triggering any of my spellcast stuff, which is what I want my one-mana cantrips to do, and so this is just kind of a bad one-mana cantrip in this cube because it does the one-mana cantrip stuff with the upside of being able to be cast for 4 mana, which is a nice trade-off, right? I'm happy for the cantrip side to not be that good. It's just draw a card, no selection, no... not seeing any more cards for that sort of, kicker mode of being able to draw more cards if you have a bunch of mana available. But the fact that first mode did not trigger all my spellcast stuff really was a big cost in that particular cube where it had a lot of spellcast payoffs. And so I think when there is no other sort of effect stapled to the cycling, it is just kind of a downside most of the time that it's just an ability and not actually casting a spell. But then on the flip side, the most iconic version of this is for sure Decree of Justice, the white modal cycling card that is a classic control win condition in old school cubes because they can't counter it when you cycle it and make 6 soldiers on their end step. It's just an uncounterable draw a card, make a bunch of soldiers, which is a nightmare for any control deck to deal with. And there, I think it's kind of bad. I love Decree of Justice. You will not find me, being a huge critic of that card. But I think if I'm honest with myself, it would be nice if that was just 2 modes and they could both be counterspelled, because in some ways that is the most important part of the card, depending on the sort of context you're playing it in, that you have this big uncounterable token generating instant.
Yeah, that's going to be a very card by card kind of basis, whether that is upside, downside, complication, ease, who knows. You mentioned kicker. Do you think kicker is actually a modal mechanic?
Because of course.
It's often been said that, there are only 2 mechanics in Magic. There is kicker and there are modal spells.
Are those the 2?
Well, the other one that they cite is split cards, which I'm going to argue split cards and modal spells are...
I feel like
different costs.
I feel like everything you're describing is kicker, basically.
Everything is kicker. You're right. There's only one mechanic and it is kicker. So I think that there is something that is a little bit distinct in that most of these modal cards that we're talking about, you have multiple different options, but the card can do totally different things. You can do A or you can do B. Kicker is different in that you're always doing A. Sometimes you can also do B, with occasional exceptions. Magic is more exceptions than rules, but that does feel meaningfully different to me. It also feels very different in terms of how I'm evaluating a card and how I'm thinking about what it's going to do in games is okay, it does the front side, and then sometimes I'll have extra mana and I'll be able to use the kicker. So I find kicker to be a little bit easier to evaluate.
Yeah, I think kicker is like in many ways the most elegant, or one of the most elegant modal mechanics. But I have to be honest with myself and admit that for all the elegance I think the mechanic has, there aren't that many cards with kicker that I really love. Like, I think ultimately...
Name all of them. Jilt.
Jilt is probably my favorite. I do really like Blood Chief's Thirst. I think it is a nice, clean kicker card, basically. What's another favorite kicker card? It's like, honestly, it's hard for me. I guess, like, honestly, I really like Vicious Offering, I think, is a really elegant kicker card, too. The 2 mana -2/-2, sacrifice a creature for kicker to give it -5/-5. It's
yeah,
kind of
kickers with alternate costs that are not mana costs are often play in pretty interesting space.
Yeah. Yeah, ultimately, I just think that it's, like, to me, one of the, like, most boring, clean mechanics in Magic that also tends to not result in a bunch of, like, inspiring card designs, which, it's funny, because I love those sort of clean bread and butter core mechanics, but oftentimes there's still, like, exciting, cool cards that can be made with them. Like, Cycling is a great example. There's a ton of Cycling cards I think are really awesome and very cool, and, like, I think inspire me. I don't feel that way about kicker cards as much, even though I think the mechanic is very elegant.
Yeah, I mean, kicker is funny because it is, so many other mechanics could just be kicker. They just gave it a little extra flavor or, like, limited the scope of what the alternate costs are.
So the mechanic means a little more because it's always being kicked in this one way or whatever.
Right. So they could have just not made kicker and instead have made a lot more individual, more flavorful mechanics. And I wonder, I think I've actually heard Mark Roser say that might have been a better direction for them to go in.
Oh, interesting. Having never making kicker.
Because there are a couple cards that care about kicker, and, you know, whenever you cast a spell that's kicked, you get some small bonus, and those payoff cards are where you really feel the kind of, like, lack of resonance there, where I kind of wish it was something, like, just named something a little bit less generic.
Yeah, if they could more elegantly name, like, if you ever pay more mana for a spell than the printed cost in the corner.
Oh yeah, that's a real clean right there.
I'm saying they can't, but if they could, that would be a cool way to kind of capture the same way that if you cycle or discard captures a bunch of other stuff in a really cool dynamic way. There isn't like,
I mean,
if you kick,
cycle or discard is also frustrating text that they printed because it
cycling is also
implies that you are not, that cycling is different from discarding.
I mean, you know why they did it, but I understand what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah, honestly, the reason I say this about kicker is because I think Roost of Drakes is a very, very cool payoff for kicker, and that's the sort of enchantment that is like only 1 blue mana, and it's when you cast a kick spell, you make a Drake, but it also has kicker itself, and if you kick it, you make a Drake 1 ETB, which is like really cool to get your payoff and also a version of the effect that works great in multiples with it. Like, it's just very nice little package. And I tried to make a like kicker theme work in Sacred Geometry, and I just could not find enough cards I wanted to play that were like clean kicker cards to make it work.
Yeah, that's also a funny limitation, is because they have created a lot of other more flavorful mechanics that are specific to planes, specific to particular sets. There are maybe just not the kicker cards that you think they're going to be when you go looking for them.
Yeah.
Into the Royal is a good one.
That's true. There's a great kicker card.
All right, we got one.
Jilt, Into the Royal. And I guess Blink of an Eye.
Great. I like an Untamed Kavu.
Burst Lightning is great. We love Burst Lightning.
Yeah.
That one's really good. What's the next modal mechanic in Magic's history, Anthony?
I think the next one, as we already alluded to, is split cards. These were first printed in Invasion, and they just printed 2 little cards on the 1 big card. Wasn't that crazy back then?
Same set as Kicker was introduced, so Invasion was just modal to a T.
Great point.
There's also all those, like, Invasion was a really modal set. There was also all of the, like, spell shapers and stuff, which had different kicker costs and, like, yeah, tons of modes.
I was wondering if spell shapers count, because it's almost like they give another mode to all the cards in your hand, but that feels like a little too far off.
I didn't mean, I mean, there's the spell shapers. Yeah, I'm not going to count that. That to me is, like, one thing. But there was the multi-kicker cards, not literally multi-kicker, that's a mechanic.
Oh, I forgot about multi-kicker.
But the battle mages is what I'm thinking of, that had 2 different kicker costs.
Yeah, I mean, in that, we could talk about rate as well, where I'm like, so many of the battle mages I think are super cool, but it's you have to be very selective.
In 2000, and so their rate is quite poor.
Yeah. So I don't know that I have a lot to say about split cards. They are similar to the modal spells. The big difference is, like with cycling, they have both multiple different effects as well as multiple different costs. So you can either choose your fire or cast your ice, not both at once yet. I just think that they visually look so unique and striking that kind of like dominates my feelings towards them.
And you don't like the way they look.
I think that it's just funny. Like, this is the 2 little cards.
I often try and like check myself when I am being maybe a little judgmental of like a crazy treatment that's coming out in a new set, and just remind myself like it's not new for Magic to come out with crazy treatments. They literally put 2 little tiny cards on a Magic card in the year 2000. Like 6 years after the game came out, they were printing little horizontal cards on a Magic card, which if they had never done that and they did that today, I would probably be like, this is so dumb. But it existed when I started playing Magic, where like I remember when Invasion came out and I thought it was so cool. And so I have, a positive association with it. And I do think that part of the reason the mechanic worked in Invasion was that they did have, again, this is a great example, I think, of the kind of resonance that is on a meta level. Like, there's nothing mechanically connected about Fire Ice, except the name Fire and Ice has this sort of like duality to it that then is represented in the actual mechanics of the cards in a way that I think makes it a pretty resonant package. Life, Death, Fire, Ice. I think these cards work in the same way that like Esper Charm works, where it's got like this level of elegance that is kind of at the layer of the mechanics, but isn't like contained within the narrative of the card. I think if they were to do that, and they probably have done this since with other sort of split cards, the split cards that don't tell that story, I think, or don't have that sort of very clean elegance to them, don't work anywhere near as well for me as some of the originals.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a very clear sort of narrative as far as when you're looking at a split card in a draft and when you're trying to evaluate, is it good enough for your deck? Again, you are asking those kinds of questions about rate, but you're like, okay, is the left side good enough and I'm only playing that color? Do I want to include just Assault in my deck? Or, well, actually, I might be splashing green, or maybe I'm just a straight-up red-green deck, so maybe I also care about battery. And so the fact that I have the flexibility to cast both halves versus including it for only one, like, that's a kind of decision space that I find pretty compelling, whereas some of the, like, more just free, you cast this, you play whatever modes you want, but it's all just upside, is not as a compelling type of evaluation to a card.
I just realized we're missing
some of these designs are just kind of crazy in that, like, yeah, life, death. Actually, in most cube contexts, you're just going to be casting death, and life is not a card you're interested in.
Every once in a while, you get them when they least expect it. I just realized we're missing Overload from our list here, because I was reminded that one thing I like about the split cards a lot is that they very clearly, visually, are like, this is 2 cards, meaning that you could play this in a deck without one of the colors. Like, you can play Fire Ice in your blue deck if you want to.
Unless you're playing Magic's most popular format, and then nothing makes sense.
Well, let's not talk about that. Which, my biggest complaint about when we got to Modern Horizons 2, and we got the off-color...
Damn
is the one I'm thinking of, but there was off-color Overload cards. That one, I think, is a non-starter for me in cubes personally, because I, myself, it was in my cube for a little while, and I just kept overlooking it as a board wipe, because it does not look like a board wipe. You're looking at a pack as a blue-white control player, and you just visually check out when you see a black frame, and you're like, well, that card's not for me. And it turns out it actually was exactly the board wipe you needed. That is the thing I think actually happens to a lot of modal cards, where, like, at a glance, you think, oh, this is a 1-mana spell, or this is a black card, or whatever. And in reality, because of the sort of nature of the balancing the modes, it's not that. But it doesn't look that way visually. The split cards are like the most dumb, obvious, idiot guy way to say, like, nope, there are two things here.
2 little cards.
But it works. It totally works.
And the questions that the conversation you would have to try and understand a split card is not nothing, but it's pretty straightforward. So I can cast this left side? Yes. I can cast this right side? Yes. Can I cast both? Nope.
Not yet.
Okay, we're done. We understand split cards now. The biggest problem with them I have is just having to turn them sideways in a draft. I'm always self-conscious about, but way better than putting text on the back.
Can you not read text a little sideways?
I can turn my head sideways like a real professional Magic player.
Do you have to turn your head sideways? Do you have to turn your head sideways to read the like spines of books on your bookshelf?
No, but I know what they are already.
So you're saying you're not actually reading them, you're just recognizing them, but you're looking at books on your bookshelf.
I guess so.
Interesting. We'll put Overload on the list so we don't miss it, because I think that's an important one. But it's a while before we get to Overload. Next one you have on the list here you put together, Anthony, is Morph from Onslaught 2 years after Invasion.
Morph is a lot like Cycling, where it doesn't necessarily read like a split card all the time or a modal card, but it absolutely is. It's just every creature that has Morph has this alternate mode of it can just be a 3-mana 2/2. I guess I also forgot about all the different Morph variants that they've come out with since, but we'll just shortcut that to Morph. And also,
there's only the one, because Manifest doesn't count.
Right, Manifest is pretty
manifest
different.
A card. The cards manifesting cards are not the ones that have the manifest ability, so it does. Disguise is the other one.
Disguise or Cloak, or I can't keep track.
The one with Ward, whatever that one is. That one's got to be added to the list too. Morph and Morph with Ward. These ones are funny too, because when you are laying out your deck, and you have a morph card, where do you put it on your curve?
Depends. If it costs like 7 mana, then I'll actually, you know what? Here's the dirty secret: is I'll lay out my deck without them, and then I'll see what space in my curve needs a little more juice.
Where you need to put the aesthetic.
Which is, I mean, honestly, maybe not unreasonable to be like, oh, I'm light on 3 drops, so it's more likely I'm going to cast this on 3. That's not totally off.
I think the funny thing about Morph for me is that the way the cards are designed, they're almost all so bad if you're not unmorphing them. Like, they have some unmorph ability, or they have some, like, in lower powered environments, just like kind of surprise power and toughness, or like, some trigger when they deal damage to a player or something, or death touch, something that really benefits the sort of secret mode, which makes sense. Like, that's what Morph is. So you want to have cards that are designed to benefit from unmorphing them in that secret mechanic. But I basically, in a cube, never expect to just be hard casting the side of a morph card unless I am like in a really weird pinch. Like, I expect that to come up 5% of the time that I'm not unmorphing my Eternal Witness or whatever. Not Eternal Witness, the other one.
Yeah, the question of rate comes up again, where it's like, you can look at this as a split card where it's whatever creature or a 3-mana 2/2, but that rate is just not going to make it a relevant mode in a lot of cubes. But you absolutely can make a cube where that's relevant if you want. Like, if your goal is to say 20% of the time it is going to be good enough to have a 3-mana 2/2.
Which I think, like, original Cons of Tarkir is kind of that.
Sure,
like,
yeah.
Like, our friend Nate has a Cons of Tarkir limited cube, which is just kind of faithfully recreating Cons of Tarkir limited, and there you are just like, great, I'm just going to cast this because I have enough mana to do it, and this is the kind of format where, like, a 6-mana 4/4 is very good. So if you're at low enough power, it can make sense, but when people just put Den Protector or whatever in their cube, I feel like you basically always want to be unmorphing it for it to be worth it, and that starts to sort of veer into the territory of, like, not actually really a modal card kind of cards that I don't tend to like. When it's like the thing printed on the card is actually a trap. Like, playing Den Protector on 2, you should basically never be doing. That starts to feel kind of bad to me in terms of communicating to my drafters, like, expectations about how cards should be used.
Yeah, I mean, Morph has a lot of other sort of baggage and complexity than just that modality, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even talking about, like, playing a card face down and, like, the knowledge of what Morph cards are in the cube, which is the thing I think a lot of people complain about. I purely just mean that I think Morph is a kind of mechanic that leads to cards that are balanced in such a way that you are rarely going to be casting the creature side without morphing it first, which just means that the mode is kind of an illusion. It's not actually a modal card, and it has the downside of the actual mana cost printed in the top right does not matter. The thing that is, like, the most important thing on every other card you're evaluating in a pack is actually largely irrelevant to these cards. What matters is the unmorph cost and knowing that it's secretly a colorless 3-drop,
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and what the unmorph cost is. I think that's a great point that it usually correlates to the cost that's in the top, but yeah, that's almost more important.
We've got time for a couple more modal mechanics here, Anthony, but this is definitely a multi-parter, which I think is fine.
Exciting. I think maybe we could just jump through the next couple very quickly because they're sort of similar. The next one that I have on my list is Entwine, which is just a riff on those original just menu style pick multiple modes. But if you do the kicker cost, which is just an additional cost, you get to do both of the modes. And here I think especially a lot of times the modes interact with each other, which makes sense. It's like when you do both, I'm thinking of like Tooth and Nail is the one that a lot of people have seen from certain popular Magic formats where you get to tutor some creatures, put them in your hand, or you get to put some creatures from your hand into play, and if you get to entwine it and do both, you get to tutor a bunch of creatures and then put them right in play.
This is somewhat similar to, what's the mechanic on split cards that says you can cast both sides if you pay both costs? Fuse. Boy, that's another one. Got to put Fuse on our list. This is kind of like Fuse, except the way you described that, I think people could potentially confuse it for Fuse. We're not talking about two actual separate effects. We're just saying like a card that, it's more like a charm that you can pay the kicker to get all the effects of the charm, but they're always just two things.
Almost always just two things. I think maybe just in some like Modern Horizon sets, they've printed some that have 3 or 4.
And then you pay the Entwine cost, you get all the effects?
You get all the effects.
It's either one or all.
Maybe that is exactly one card I'm thinking of, but
that's the kind of thing they would do in Modern Horizons. It makes a lot of sense. This to me is actually just kicker.
It's almost just kicker, except you can choose what the first mode is on the cheap side of it.
But like, you could definitely write that out. Like,
kicker, do A or B.
You could mechanically make the exact same card, just written a little differently with the kicker mechanic.
It'd be written pretty differently.
Not really.
If you say so.
I mean, you say like, spell, choose 1 or 2. If spell was kicked, do all.
Okay, sure. Fine. Fine, it's just kicker. Everything's kicker.
I'm just
Do you
saying,
like kicker?
I'm just saying this one I think is one of the closest to like actually just being kicker. This and overload, which maybe we should talk about overload now instead of putting it on our list and talking about it later. Like overload is very similar. All the overload cards ask you to choose a target, and if you pay the overload cost instead of the main cost, you instead replace that target with each. So for Cyclonic Rift, for example, you can return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand, or you cast overload, you return each non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. Is this the first time we see them like kind of playing with language as a mechanic? Like we'll get to other examples of this, but this is one where they're like, just swap a word out, which is kind of a funny way to write a modal mechanic.
The only other instance I can think of before that would be like color changing effects or like change the name of a basic land type. But yeah, this is definitely very weird where they're like change this particular word in a spell. And I do wonder about like, was that a challenge for the translation teams at all? But yeah, I mean, the way that these cards are written, the individual card designs make it fairly intuitive. It's like destroy an artifact or destroy all your artifacts. Like the one wrinkle that maybe can surprise people on some of these cards is they'll be very specific about destroy an artifact an opponent controls, so that when you overload it, you don't destroy all of yours. But, I mean, like, damn, sometimes they don't have that your opponent's rider on it, so it does destroy everything.
I think the other funky rider that sometimes comes up is that they could have written this in a way that, like, if you targeted a thing, it then also like targeted everything else it could also target, but there's no target, so you can't fizzle the Cyclonic Rift by like getting rid of one of the things it targets. It just no longer targets anything.
So you can use Cyclonic Rift.
It's no longer a crime.
It's not a crime.
Overloading a spell is not a crime. It was a crime, but you did it enough. It's no longer a crime.
Oh, it's just like capitalism. If you steal a little bit, it's a crime. If you steal millions and millions, That's just being a savvy good
businessman.
business. That's just smart. Crazy how that works out. That is how that works, right? Like if you can Cyclonic Rift your opponent's true name Nemesis if they have 2 creatures in play, right?
Yeah.
Do they even need to have 2 creatures? You don't need to choose a target at all.
You don't choose at all. You cast it for overloaded. You just
overload. Interesting. I mean, overload obviously is also a very flavorful mechanic, and because the scaling up of targeting everything that's a valid, or not even a valid target, anything that can be affected, is so huge that the overload costs are often much, much more expensive than the base costs. So in a lot of Cube environments, you're like, I'm pretty much playing this as the first half, and then every once in a while I get to do this big explosive thing, which is going to be very fun.
Which I love that about those cards. I think that's a great distribution of like attention, like the fact that the mana cost in the top right and the effect you read on the card is probably in most instances what the card is going to do, and then it has this kind of ambitious, over the top, like it's almost like a Planeswalker ultimate. It's like, do I have to read that? Maybe. I can probably trust that if I'm overloading it, I'm in a very good position, and the game has gone quite well for me, but I'm treating this as like the sort of baseline as a assumption for where I'm going to be casting it most of the time.
Right. It's also the overload costs are the same, or the overload effects are the same thing but more, so it's not like once you know what overload does, you don't need to necessarily read the details on each one.
Right, say for the weird Modern Horizons riff, like
except for the weird ones,
where it changes kind of completely. But
good point.
That's what Modern Horizons is for the weird exceptions that kind of take these mechanics and twist them in funny ways. Let's do one more, Anthony, and then we'll wrap up episode 1 of Question Mark for the. I mean, honestly, we can do one now, and we'll have I think enough mechanics to do probably 2 more of these before more cards get released, and then every like 3 years or 4 years we'll just do here's another episode about all the modal mechanics of the past 3 or 4 years.
Sure. I mean, I'm excited also to talk more about I think we're doing a little bit as we go, but talk about how these impact Cube and how we think about them as designers. But yeah, it's kind of interesting just to go look through the history.
I think we peppered it in a way that's probably how we're gonna have to do it if we're gonna do it like this, because there's just too many to talk about. So the last one for this episode is going to be Channel, correct? Originally printed in Saviors of Kamigawa.
That's what I got on my list.
Channel is an ability like cycling, so it is also not casting a spell, and it basically says instead of casting the spell, you can channel it from your hand, and channeling it gives you some effect, and you discard the card. So it is really close to just being a sort of charm style 2 effects, except it is written in this particular way, and that allowed them to do a thing which they never did on the charms, which is basically have the non-channel side of the spell be a permanent that sits in play,
right?
Which is something that would have been really weird on like one of the charms or a split card, but now it's like this is just a permanent that sits in play, but if you want to channel it to get a spell-esque effect out of it instead, you can.
Yeah, I think it's actually more close to the split cards than the modal cards, because it is 2 distinct costs, two almost always very distinct abilities, although often there's some flavorful connection between them, which I like. I do think it is a little bit weird that they don't trigger spells, and I feel like I've had this issue in a couple cube environments where I've looked at some channel cards that I think are really interesting, but then the fact that they're uncounterable isn't necessarily an issue, but the fact that they just don't interact with a lot of stuff. But, like you said, they do allow you to, like, in many cases, get a permanent into the graveyard very quickly, which is something that I think is very relevant, or turn on Delirium, or do other things like that.
Yeah, I think channel in a cube with discard themes, Delirium themes, other type card type matters sort of themes can be very cool. Otherwise, I do agree that it's kind of... This one, I think, a, like, less enfranchised player is very liable to think like, oh, why can't I counterspell that? Like, you're paying some mana.
You're doing a thing.
You're paying some mana. You're
it.
revealing a card from your hand. It's going to the graveyard. An effect is happening. That feels an awful lot like casting a spell. Like, why am I not able to interact with that? I can see that being kind of a barrier for some people. And I will also say, I think this is one of the ones for whom the name is like the least resonant. Like,
well, I disagree with that because I think that the individual cards that work best for me are the ones
the first ones. The early ones where like the effect was very similar to what the
Sure, yeah. If the effect is very
doing.
tied to the permanent. I mean, and there's some more recent ones like Twin Shot Sniper is a card that I see in a lot of cubes, and this is a creature with an ETB, but if you just don't have 4 mana to be able to cast the creature, you can just channel it and get that same ETB of dealing 2 damage, or like Mnemonic Sphere is similar, where you can just... It's not quite evoke because it doesn't enter the battlefield, so you can't ephemerate it, but sure, yeah, I see what you're saying. But yeah, those where you're like, oh, I don't have enough for my big creature, but I will channel its effect and just get that little bit of the soupçon of Twin Shot Sniper.
The essence of Twin Shot Sniper is
just get his
killing
vibes.
Your creature.
So I like it in those contexts, but I agree when it is just like totally distinct. But honestly, I think that a lot of the channel effects do feel somewhat narratively cohesive.
Something I feel like I'm realizing as we go through this list is that a lot of these, the first implementation of them, I do really like, because I think when a mechanic is new, there is maybe a higher bar for like, we have to do this right to get people to understand it. And then once it's like, oh, people love split cards, now they have like a lot more slack they give themselves in R&D to be like, people love this, we can just do this whenever we want and don't have to have sort of such a high standard for what they actually do. I feel like oftentimes a new mechanic I will like the cards in, and then sometimes we return to that mechanic and I no longer am in love with the actual implementations of them, which is maybe a pattern that's going to show up in a lot of these mechanics.
That's interesting. I mean, I could also see there being both like the first time they're mining the lowest hanging fruit.
Yep, that's also a fact for sure.
And they're also, I mean, this is sort of what you're saying, but they're being maybe a little bit more restrained and just making sure that things are understandable and it's like the mechanic is clear. And then, once it is successful, they give themselves a lot more space. I wouldn't say as much like cutting themselves more slack as far as like being more willing to push boundaries and try and do different things with it. And sometimes that boundary pushing is not as compelling.
I have considered adding 1 Planeswalker in each monocolor to Sacred Geometry to introduce that card type to the cube and do it in a way that I feel like is elegant. And it is amazing to me that after all these years, I think if you try to pick the most elegant Planeswalker in each color, literally 3 of them I think are very obviously from the first 5 Planeswalkers ever printed. Liliana of the Veil, Garruk Wildspeaker, and Jace Beleren are just some of the most simple, clean, elegant Planeswalkers ever, because that was like the lowest hanging fruit, and they just like did it first, and it was the first time they were printing this card type, and so there was obviously a ton of attention, a ton of scrutiny on them to make sure they were like clear and players could get them. And it's funny that I honestly don't think in any of those colors they have topped the elegance of those first Planeswalkers.
Yeah, I mean, if your bar is, or your way you're judging them as elegance, then I think simplicity was definitely a priority, and I think that you're right, and there are probably no other cards that were given as much scrutiny as those Planeswalkers. Like, they've even talked about how they intended to put them in sets earlier and just didn't feel that they were ready, and just like spent a lot of time trying to make sure that those cards were really right, because they knew that people could, and many people were, put off by them. So they didn't want to have any shortcomings in those cards.
Yeah, it's funny. It also gave me language which I had never considered to describe the kinds of Planeswalkers I like, which is that I really like Planeswalkers whose abilities are shortcuttable to known spells.
Sure.
Especially iconic ones, which, if you look like word for word, are like all the new Planeswalkers more complicated than the old ones. Not always. Some old Planeswalkers do have a lot of text on them, but when that a lot of text is just, here is a spell or like a very common effect that's like iconic in Magic, that is what this ability amounts to. cool. When this text is explaining that you make a unique token and mill some cards and do some other stuff that is like very specific to this particular loyalty ability.
Also, when it's in my graveyard, it's a bug. Don't worry about it.
Sure. That is when the sort of complexity of Planeswalker starts to feel more like a burden to me. And so there are some complicated Planeswalkers I really like. It's when their loyalty abilities are shortcuttable to spells. It's like, yeah, this is 3 cards in 1 card, or at least 2 cards and then an ultimate, I think is reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that applies to other card types as well, even something like a creature. I think Twin Shot Sniper is a perfect example where there's like a ton of complexity to this card, and the strategic depth of, I'm going to put this in my deck so I can channel it so I can get both a creature and an artifact in my graveyard for Delirium. Like, there's a lot going on there, but it is very easily shortcuttable to, it's a 4-mana, 2/3 with reach, ETB shock, or I can just shock.
Yeah, it's a shock or a weird FTK, basically.
Right. Shock Tongue Goblin Archer.
Shock Tongue Goblin. I think this was a great conversation, Anthony. Good podcast episode.
I think it's a great way to end an episode of a podcast.
Let's go around the room
You're
and
not
talk
supposed
about
to talk about the show on the show.
Let's go around the room and talk about how great we just did at our job. This is not our job. We make no money from this, which is why I want to take an opportunity here to say that we've got a fair few new listeners, I think, thanks to the attention from Ristic Studies. If you're a new listener to the show and this is one of your first few episodes, I'm glad you've been enjoying it.
Or hate listening to it and sticking with it.
If you hate listening, that's fine. I'm gonna block you on Reddit so I don't read your dumb comments every week. That's just what's gonna happen.
There's things we have to do for our mental health.
But if you are listening and you enjoy the show, you can go leave a rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. That certainly helps. But the thing I really want you to do more than anything, if you want to help the show, is just tell a friend or two. If you think somebody might like this show, somebody that maybe loves Magic but is perhaps feeling a little burnt out by all the new stuff and trying to sort of focus on the parts of the game they really love, that's what we're aiming to do here. So pass this along to somebody that you think might like the show is something we'd really appreciate. It means a lot to Anthony and I. And that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. We will come back to the remainder of these modal mechanics, just in the ones that you were able to sort of identify this afternoon in like 30 minutes. We only made it about a third of the way through. Now, I think as we go, we'll probably end up going quicker because they will more reference older mechanics and things we've already talked about, but I'm also sure there's many we're still missing from this list. So there's been a lot of modal mechanics in Magic's history, and they do each kind of have their own unique considerations.
Yeah, it is interesting how I thought more it's like, once we talk about kicker and split cards, everything else is a slight reframing, but then it's like, oh, well, we have
reframing
this
matters, though.
new mechanic, and then that one's building off of that one. So it actually, it is an interesting way to kind of see a little bit more of the history of the game in the way that it is constantly self-referential and building off of what they've done previously.
So stay tuned for that. It will not be next week. I don't like doing them back-to-back. It'll be sometime in the future. We got a little mini-series we'll be doing here. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Thinking Really Hard About Magic Cards, reading all their modes, and then speaking into microphones about it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thanks for talking about modal spells with me, and the other modes that you have, like fixing your sump pump.
It was definitely, I had to reflect.
This week? I was trying to remember what we did together this week. We had hot dogs. Thank you for delicious hot dogs.
I had to reflect on the moment from this past Tuesday, or maybe the Tuesday before, where you were talking to Vinny about your hobbies, and then he was like, oh, Andy, what other hobbies do you have? And I was like, well, I make the podcast, and I play Magic, and I also cook, but not as well or investedly as Anthony. And
cooking is not a linear experience. You bring your own value to the table.
But just objectively, like in terms of how large the hobby looms in your life, the cooking hobby looms much larger. It takes up more of your time and energy and attention. It takes
up a lot of my time and
than
energy.
It does of my time and energy and attention. Anyway, things to reflect on.
Do you feel like you don't have enough hobbies? We can get you some more hobbies.
No, I feel like this hobby is too all-encompassing, and more to come on that in the future, maybe.
I see. Okay, well, let's work on it.
A man with at least 2 modes, watching birds and wrangling nerds. Wait, Anthony. Did I say Anthony the first time?
I don't know. Take your time.
Anthony, a man with at least 2 modes, wrangling birds. No, wait, not wrangling birds. My ass.
You want to write this down first?
No, it's fine.